The parable of the prodigal son is one of my favourites, but it is such an amazing story at so many levels, and there has been book after book after book written about this particular parable. There's just so much in it, it's almost hard to know where to start. But the context is given to us in verses 1 to 3 that Sonia read well for us. Jesus tells these stories. There's the lost sheep and the lost coin, and then this one, what we normally call the prodigal son. And they are a defence against the grumbling around Jesus. Those who were saying, well, this guy receives and eats with sinners. Now, if you know anything about that Middle Eastern culture, and even still very much these days in many cultures, if you receive guests and you're eating with people, it does say something about who you are. Now, certainly in Jesus' day, a wealthy person could feed any number of people, extras. That's no problem. But to actually receive them yourself and to eat with them was a sign of hospitality. And really what you were saying is, it is my honour to have you in my house. And they would actually say that in formal ways of greeting when they would receive guests and begin the meal. But then it was the guests' turn to turn around and say, oh, well, it's my honour to be in your house and to be in your presence, and there's this, the hospitable role meant all sorts of swapping of relationship and people coming together. And it usually meant quite some investment of time. And we're told that's what Jesus was doing with sinners. And that seemed to be wrong to those around him, or at least some of them. And so, in defence of his actions, why he would do this, he tells them 3 stories. One about a woman who loses a coin. One about a shepherd who loses a sheep. And then one about a man who has 2 lost sons. Now, these are all pictures of ordinary human life and situations in which we, as readers and interpreters of these stories, we get glimpses of how God loves us. So understanding this parable and unpacking the story is really that we might get a better glimpse of how God loves us. Nowhere does Jesus actually say, the man in fact is God, or anything like that. He's just telling a story about an ordinary man who has 2 fairly typical sons. But there are some atypical things in this story, that's for sure. Some of the details that I want to pick up start with the offence of the son's request. He's the younger son for a start, so in Jesus' day would have had no right to claim any inheritance from the father. But he asks for a portion of the share. Now, if you go through any of these traditional cultures, any traditional villages, farmers particularly, and you ask them, if the younger son asked an older father to have his inheritance now, what would it mean? Unanimously they'd say, well, he's asking or saying that he wishes his father was dead already. If you were to ask any of those villagers and farmers, has this ever happened before? I would almost be willing to bet they would say, never has that happened in our village. And if you said, well, what would happen if a younger son demanded that of the father? Most of them would say something along the lines of, oh, well, I'd take him out the back and beat him, surely. or something to that effect. It's an outrageous request. In this time and place, in this culture that Jesus is telling the story, it was outrageous. And a huge offence to the father, to the older brother, to the community, particularly as he goes and sells the property and leaves for a far land. You know, he wants to get as far away from all of these rules and regulations as he can and live his life in freedom that apparently he feels he doesn't have here at home. There's a certain lack of action by the older brother, you'll note. He doesn't really come in at all until the very end. But in Jesus' day, if this were to have happened, there is a responsibility and expectation that the older brother would have come in, stepped in to try and bring some reconciliation between the father and this son who clearly just wishes his father was dead. But the older brother doesn't. He remains silent. Even when the younger brother is asking for part of his inheritance, maybe there's something happening here where he thinks, oh, well, if he takes that portion of the farm or the money or whatever and leaves, excellent, because I'd rather he was gone. Maybe there's something of that happening for the older brother. But he takes no action to reconcile the father and the son or to step in where he should. The really strange thing is that the father accepts. The really odd thing in this passage so far is that the father says yes. That would have been unheard of to Jesus' listeners. And we see something, one of those glimpses of God's love that is almost saying, when we want to go off in our own track, when a child dislikes being home so much, there's no point in trying to pin them down or force them to stay. But the love of this father allows the son to go, hoping that he might one day come home. Well, we know what happens. He gets off into the far country and he spends all that he has, and things go badly in that country and there's a famine, and before he knows it, he's lost all his money, he's lost all his friends, and then his freedom now means that he ties himself to a Gentile, of all things, and then is sent out to feed the pigs. You know, a horror of all horrors for a Jew. So his freedom is very quickly now bondage and the worst kind of service. And we're told he comes to his senses. There's this sort of a momentary flash of maybe repentance, but we can see he has a plan. He thinks, well, my father's servants all have plenty. Why should I starve here? I'll go back and be like them. But what we notice is that his plan means that he doesn't have to be in relationship with his father or his brother. He says, you know, I'm not fit to be called your son anymore. Treat me like one of your hired servants. Now, this has a bunch of advantages for him, doesn't it? Now if he comes back, he doesn't have to live in his father's house. He can just be an ordinary bloke in the village. He gets paid. He might even be able to earn a bit and start to pay back his father. Doesn't have to live under his brother's roof and live off his brother's inheritance. Doesn't have to worry about those relationships that he's actually flushed down the toilet at the beginning of this story. It's a good plan. He decides to come home. But what we find, the next really startling thing, is the action of the father. The action of the father is not what any one of Jesus' listeners would have expected. You see, they would have expected this failed son, had gone off to a faraway country, who didn't make it good, but rather has failed in his attempts to live large, comes crawling home. There's the father who would, want to string him up. There's the brother who would probably also want to string him up. There's the entire village who's sort of had to cope with not only the disgrace, but also the offence of what he's done and said about them and about the family, and sold up and ruined the farm and all of this sort of stuff. And so one of the first things that the father does is run out to meet him. The father sees him while he was still a long way off, and he runs to meet him. Now, that could be this, Hollywood romantic, running down the beach, arms open, and the other. It could be that, or it could be that the father is deliberately going out before a mob grabs him and lynches him. Before the village, in fact, sees him and is talking and saying, "Oh, it's that one coming back," and starting to talk about what a useless character he was. So before anything negative like that happens, the father goes out and meets him before he gets home, before he reaches the village. Most likely out of protection. The father kisses him. And that's significant because it shows a restored relationship. It shows from the father's side that he has forgiven any offence. He's not worried about what the son did or said or intended. But he kisses him as a sign of welcome, a sign that all is forgiven. Then you'll notice that he calls the servants, who have mysteriously gathered around, probably with a mob from the village. But he calls to the servants and says, "Get the best robe in the house." Whose is the best robe in the house? It's the father's. It's the father's. He says, "Go and get the best robe and bring it and put it on him." What is he saying to the servants? Is he said, "Go and get the best robe and now dress my son." Now, are the servants, going to diss the son? They have been given a clear message that the father says he's back, and he's not to be, picked on or beaten or, slandered. I'm not angry with him. Rather, it's the opposite. He's going out of his way to show this son is to be welcomed like nothing happened. Like there was no break, but rather he is fully restored into relationship. And so he's restoring the relationship of the servants who are to look after and serve the son also. So that when he's in his robe and later on there's the party, everybody in the village who comes will also know he's been given the best robe. He's been given this robe that would have been kept for the father for very special occasions. He says, "Get a ring and put it on his finger." It's a signet ring. It's a ring of membership of the family. More than that, it indicates that the father now trusts the son. With the ring, he can speak on behalf of the family, even maybe purchase things, rack up expenses on the family farm. Imagine that to this son who just squandered everything. The ring says amazing amount of trust has been restored to this person. And then he says, put shoes on his feet, which symbolise he's no longer, or he's not going to be called a servant. But shoes means he's a member of the family, that rather he is the one who's to be served. And one of their jobs as servants would be to put his shoes on. Then he kills the fatted calf and orders that be brought and a celebration. Now you have to realise the people at the time, Jesus' day, would have realised, and they would know, if you kill a calf, a whole cow, you are planning a huge celebration. You know, he could have said, oh, well, let's just kill a lamb. That'll be good for, you know, the whole household, all the servants could come and have a feast and a barbecue and a party. But he says, no, we need a big celebration because we're going to invite the entire village. And it would be unheard of if he was to kill the fatted calf and not invite the whole village. That would have been offensive to them. But the intent is he's now restoring the son to the whole village. One calf would have fed 100 people, I'm reliably told. I haven't tried recently, but... So, how does this story answer the question, or the grumbling, this man receives and eats with sinners? The answer is really simple. Jesus is saying to those people complaining that anyone who's lost, anyone who's far away, even the one who stayed home but is still lost in himself and doesn't understand the love of the Father, belongs to God. God is claiming them all and saying, they're all mine and I want them back. I want them restored into my family because my love is so great, I would go to any lengths to have them back. And it's that love that changes the Son. It's that love that he accepts when he realises, you know, he had this plan, he was going to come back, but not really be restored in terms of relationship. But the Father doesn't let him. The Father says, you are my son. You were lost and now you are found. At that point, the son could have said and continued on with his plan. No, I'm not good enough to be called your son. Make me like a hired servant and I'll be off here to the side and work my way back into village and family. But the Father says, no, you're my son and I love you too much for that. And I am going to restore you to the Father, to your brother, to the village. That is how much God loves all of us. The very littlest, the very youngest, who don't understand, to the very oldest. God loves us all and would do anything to have us back.